A respected Texas correctional officer. A secret affair behind bars. A deadly disease. And a husband who knew too much. She had spent years upholding the law, but behind the prison walls, she was breaking every rule. What started as a dangerous romance led to a shocking betrayal and a brutal execution-style murder. Some secrets can destroy lives. But when those secrets involve deception, forbidden love, and a deadly disease, the consequences can be fatal. How far would someone go to protect a secret that could ruin everything? Welcome to True Crime Exposed, where we dive deep into the most shocking true crime cases. If you love real-life stories of betrayal, obsession, and murder, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never. Reynolds appeared to be the perfect couple. Tanya, 34, was a dedicated correctional officer at a Texas state prison, a woman who commanded respect in her uniform. Eric, 36, was a hard-working construction worker, known for his easygoing nature and unwavering love for his wife. To those around them, they were a stable, loving couple, married for over a decade, financially comfortable, and deeply connected. But behind closed doors, Tanya was leading a double life. The long hours at the prison, the sudden mood shifts, and the unexplained nights where she seemed distant, Eric chalked it up to job stress. Working in a prison wasn't easy, and Tanya often talked about how exhausting it was to deal with the inmates. But what Eric didn't know was that his wife wasn't just managing the prisoners, she was involved with one. Jasmine Carter, 29, was serving time for armed robbery. She had a reputation inside, tough, charismatic, and capable of manipulating anyone she set her sights on. Tanya first encountered Jasmine during a routine cell check. At first, their exchanges were brief, nothing beyond standard officer-inmate interactions. But Jasmine had a way of getting under people's skin, making them feel seen, understood. Tanya, who had spent years in a passionless marriage, found herself drawn to Jasmine in ways she never expected. It started with small favors, letting Jasmine stay out a little longer during recreational time, slipping her extra commissary items. Then, the stolen glances turned into whispered conversations, the conversations turned into secret notes, and eventually, it escalated into something much more dangerous. Tanya wasn't just cheating. She was risking everything, her career, her reputation, her freedom, all for an inmate who knew exactly how to keep her hooked. Jasmine Carter was the kind of woman who could make anyone weak with just a look. She wasn't just attractive, she was dangerously alluring. At 29, she had a body that made men and women alike turn their heads. Smooth caramel skin, high cheekbones, and full lips that always seemed to be smirking, like she knew a secret no one else did. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes could hold a person in place, and the way she carried herself, confident, unbothered, like the world belonged to her, made her irresistible. Even in a prison jumpsuit, she oozed raw sexuality. Tanya had never questioned her own desires before. She had been married to Eric for over a decade, comfortable in a routine that felt safe but uninspired. But Jasmine? Jasmine was different. She was exciting, unpredictable. She made Tanya feel alive in a way she never had before. At first, it was just flirtation, Jasmine teasing Tanya during her rounds, giving her slow, deliberate looks that lingered too long. A playful touch on the hand when Tanya handed her something. Subtle at first, but soon, the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing. She studied Tanya, learned her weaknesses, her frustrations, her secrets. And when she saw the hesitation in Tanya's eyes, the way her breath would hitch whenever Jasmine leaned in a little too close, she knew she had her. The first time it happened, it was quick and reckless, stolen kisses in a dark hallway, hands gripping desperately, the thrill of knowing they could be caught at any moment. It should have scared Tanya, but instead, it sent her spiraling deeper. Jasmine had her hooked, and she used that power to her advantage. Tanya started taking risks, smuggling in little things at first. a pack of cigarettes, an extra meal from the cafeteria. Then it escalated. A prepaid phone, so they could talk whenever they wanted. Cash slipped inside books. Eventually, even drugs, carefully concealed in her uniform, handed off in moments when no one was watching. She knew she was playing a dangerous game. If she got caught, she'd lose everything, her job, her freedom, her marriage. But Jasmine had a way of making Tanya forget all of that. Every whispered promise, every stolen moment together made Tanya want her more. Meanwhile, Eric had no idea. He still kissed his wife goodbye in the mornings, still believed she was working long, grueling shifts. He had no clue that while he lay in bed alone at night, Tanya was sneaking off to be with someone else. Someone who was pulling her further and further into a world she would soon have no way out of. Tanya never imagined that one reckless decision could set off a chain reaction that would destroy everything. But secrets don't stay buried forever, especially when they come with deadly consequences. It started months earlier. Tanya had been careless. Too wrapped up in her dangerous love affair with Jasmine to think about the risks. When Jasmine first hinted that she had a past, Tanya brushed it off. Jasmine was beautiful, confident, irresistible. Tanya didn't care what had come before. But Jasmine never told the whole truth. Jasmine had lived a fast life before prison, wild nights, unprotected encounters, lovers who came and went. By the time she was locked up, she had already been diagnosed with HIV. She knew, but she didn't care. To her, it was just another part of life, another consequence of the streets. She never mentioned it to Tanya. Their physical relationship had been intense, passionate, and reckless. Tanya didn't think twice about protection. She believed Jasmine when she said she was clean. She believed her because she wanted to. Then, months later, the symptoms started. Eric was the first to notice something was wrong. At first, it was just fatigue. He was always tired, even after a full night's sleep. Then came the night sweats, waking up drenched, sheets soaked through. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just stress from work, but when he started losing weight without trying, he knew something was seriously wrong. Tanya watched it all unfold in silence. She told herself it was nothing. But deep down, a sickening dread began to take hold. Eric finally made an appointment with the doctor. He sat in the sterile office, waiting, his mind racing. When the results came back, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. HIV positive. He sat there in shock, unable to process the words. How? He had been faithful. He had never strayed, never once put himself at risk. The only way this could have happened was through Tanya. That night, Eric waited for Tanya to come home. His hands were shaking. His mind was spinning. The moment she walked through the door, he confronted her. "What the hell is going on, Tanya?" His voice was tight with rage and fear. "What?" she asked, setting her bag down, trying to act normal. "I have HIV." Silence. Tanya's face went pale. Her mouth opened, then closed. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The hell it isn't. I've never cheated. So that means it came from you." Tanya's mind raced. Her stomach twisted into knots. No, that doesn't make sense. Maybe the test is wrong." "It's not wrong, Tanya." Eric slammed his fist on the counter. "Tell me the truth. Who have you been with?" "I haven't." "Don't you dare lie to me." Tanya was trapped. Panic clawed at her chest. She had to think fast. "I don't know how this happened," she said, voice shaking. "Maybe you got it some other way." Eric's face twisted in disgust. "You're trying to gaslight me? After everything? I've been faithful to you for 14 damn years. So, tell me, who is he?" Tanya was desperate now. "No one, Eric. I swear." She knew the truth would destroy everything. That if Eric found out she had been sleeping with an inmate, a woman, he would never forgive her. But Eric wasn't letting this go. He stormed past her, grabbed his car keys. I'm getting tested again. And if it comes back the same, I'm getting a damn lawyer. Tanya stood frozen. For the first time, she realized something. Eric wasn't just angry. He was going to expose her. And she couldn't let that happen. Tanya sat in her car outside the prison, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind was a storm. Eric's accusations, his devastated face when he confronted her, the horror in his eyes when he realized she was the one who had infected him. But it wasn't true. It couldn't be true. She refused to believe it. There had to be another explanation. That evening, after her shift ended, Tanya stormed through the prison halls, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step felt heavier, fueled by rage, confusion, and a deep, gnawing fear. She finally reached Jasmine's cell, her eyes locking onto the woman who had turned her life upside down. Jasmine sat casually on her cot, legs crossed, looking as breathtaking as ever. Her smooth caramel skin glowed under the dim light, and her full lips curled into a knowing smirk. She was dangerous, intoxicatingly beautiful, and Tanya hated how her body still reacted to her presence. Tanya's voice came out as a hiss. Tell me the truth. Jasmine arched a perfectly shaped brow. About what, baby? The word made Tanya flinch. Did you know? Tanya took a step closer, her fists clenched. Did you know you had HIV before she couldn't even finish the sentence. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she leaned back against the wall, letting out a slow, humorless chuckle. Took you long enough to figure it out. Tanya felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She staggered back, shaking her head. No. No, you're lying. Jasmine's smirk deepened. You really think I didn't know? You think I didn't see my test results when they booked me? She shrugged. I just didn't care. And neither did you, apparently. Tanya's stomach twisted violently. Her vision blurred with fury. You used me, she choked out. Jasmine stood, sauntering toward the bars, her movements slow and deliberate. You wanted me, Tanya. You would have done anything for me. She reached through the bars, tracing a finger along Tanya's wrist. And you did. Tanya yanked her arm away, bile rising in her throat. Jasmine laughed softly. And now? Now you're just mad because the game caught up to you. Tanya turned and walked away, her ears ringing, Jasmine's laughter echoing behind her. She needed to get tested. The next morning, Tanya sat in the cold, sterile exam room, her foot tapping nervously against the tiled floor. She had barely slept. Her entire body felt like it was on fire from stress and fear. The doctor finally entered, holding a clipboard, his expression unreadable. Tanya, he said gently, we got your results back. Her stomach plummeted. His next words made her world tilt off its axis. You're HIV positive. Tanya stared at him, the words not making sense, her brain refusing to process them. No. No, no, no. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The doctor continued, his voice softer now. We need to discuss treatment options, but first, I just want to. She didn't hear the rest. The room spun. Her chest tightened, and suddenly, she couldn't breathe. This was real. She had done this to Eric. She was the reason her husband was dying. She was the monster. For the first time since it all started, Tanya realized she had no one to blame but herself. And now, there was only one way to fix it. Tanya sat in silence, gripping the edges of the kitchen table. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Eric knew too much. If he went through with his threats, everything would unravel. He would tell the doctors. He would tell the police. He would tell the prison board. And then what? She'd be fired. Arrested. Humiliated. And Jasmine? Jasmine would turn on her in a heartbeat to save herself. No, she couldn't let that happen. She needed a way out. The plan formed slowly, creeping into her mind like a shadow. At first, it was just a fleeting thought: what if Eric never got the chance to expose her? But the more she thought about it, the more the idea solidified. It wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about survival. That night, Tanya sat across from Eric at the dinner table, watching him eat. He barely looked at her. His anger hadn't faded, and she knew he was still planning his next move. She reached for his glass of whiskey, her hands steady as she poured just enough sedative into it to make him weak but not unconscious. Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how I'm supposed to live with this, Tanya. I don't even know who you are anymore." She forced herself to look wounded, ashamed. "I love you, Eric. I never wanted this to happen." He scoffed but took a long sip of his drink. She waited. Within 20 minutes, his body began to betray him. His limbs felt heavy, his speech slowed, and he swayed slightly as he stood up. "Damn, I don't feel right," he mumbled, gripping the edge of the table. Tanya stood, wrapping an arm around his waist as if she was concerned. "Come to bed. You just need to rest." Eric nodded sluggishly, barely able to hold himself up. She led him to their bedroom, lowering him onto the mattress. As soon as his head hit the pillow, he was nearly out. His eyelids fluttered, and he mumbled something incoherent. Tanya stood over him, her breath slow and controlled. This was it. She walked over to the closet and retrieved the gun she had owned for years but rarely used. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, more final. She turned back to the bed. Eric was still breathing, his chest rising and falling slowly, his face relaxed in a drugged haze. He didn't even know what was coming. The moment Tanya pulled the trigger, the room erupted with sound. The deafening gunshot bounced off the walls, shaking the air with its violent finality. Eric's body jerked once before collapsing into absolute stillness. Blood splattered against the headboard, seeping into the crisp white sheets like ink spilling across a blank page. Tanya stood frozen, her pulse hammering against her skull. The smell of gunpowder and copper filled her nostrils. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the gun, forcing herself to take slow, deep breaths. It was done. There was no going back now. But she had to be smart. Tanya knew she had only minutes before the neighbors, if they had heard the shot, started asking questions. She moved quickly, wiping the gun clean of her fingerprints before pressing Eric's limp hand around the grip. She positioned his fingers to make it look as if he had shot himself, even tilting his head slightly to create a more believable trajectory. She tossed a chair to the ground, pulled open a few drawers, and knocked over a lamp to create the illusion of a struggle. She even used the back of her hand to smear some of Eric's blood onto the doorknob, a last-minute detail to simulate an intruder's escape. Everything needed to be flawless. Once satisfied, she picked up her phone, her hands shaking, not from grief, but from the need to sell the performance. She took a deep, rattling breath before dialing 911. The second the call connected, she let out a choked sob. "My husband, oh my God, he shot himself." Her voice broke in all the right places, her breathing erratic. The dispatcher remained calm, asking for details, but Tanya barely responded, just gasping, wailing, creating the perfect image of a wife in shock. "Ma'am, help is on the way. Stay with me. Is he breathing?" Tanya let out a strangled cry. "No, oh God, no, there's so much blood." She rocked back and forth, pressing her forehead against the mattress, letting the tears fall freely. It had to be real. By the time the police arrived, Tanya was still kneeling beside the bed, cradling Eric's lifeless hand. Her entire body shook as she looked up at them with wide, tear-filled eyes. "He's gone," she whispered. The initial officers on the scene approached cautiously, glancing around the disheveled bedroom. The apparent suicide was suspicious from the start, no signs of forced entry, no gunpowder residue on Eric's hands. One officer frowned, exchanging a glance with his partner. "Ma'am, you said he shot himself?" Tanya sniffled, nodding rapidly. "Why yes, we had been fighting. He was so angry. And then she let out a fresh sob, covering her face with shaking hands. The officer's gaze flickered to the nightstand. The glass of whiskey remained untouched aside from a few sips. The bottle sat beside it, barely moved. "Has he been drinking a lot lately?" the officer asked. Tanya hesitated for half a second. "Yes, he was upset." A paramedic knelt beside Eric's body, checking for any remaining vitals. "There's something off about the blood splatter," he murmured to one of the officers. "The angle doesn't match a self-inflicted wound." Tanya's stomach twisted. But she had expected questions. She had prepared for them. "He was sitting up," she insisted, her voice raw. "Then he fell back after she buried her face in her hands again, letting her shoulders shake with grief. It was enough to momentarily silence the doubts. A fatal mistake. Tanya thought she had accounted for everything. But she hadn't planned for Jasmine. 2 days after the murder, detectives found something Tanya had overlooked: Jasmine's love letters, tucked away in Tanya's work locker. A security officer at the prison had discovered them during a routine search, and once investigators got a hold of them, everything changed. The letters painted a damning picture. Tanya's affair. Her betrayal. The love triangle that Eric had uncovered. And suddenly, the police had a new theory. They subpoenaed Eric's medical records. Once they confirmed his HIV diagnosis, and that Tanya had known about it, the puzzle pieces snapped into place. Eric hadn't just died. He had been silenced. A week after Eric's murder, Tanya sat in the interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been called in for more questioning, but this time, the air felt different. Colder. Detective Jacob Reed leaned forward, sliding a folder across the table. He flipped it open, revealing photos of the crime scene, the autopsy report, and the letters from Jasmine. Tanya swallowed hard. "You told us Eric shot himself," Reed said, his voice calm but firm. "But the ballistics don't match. The angle of entry was inconsistent with suicide. There was no gunpowder on his hands. And then there's this," he tapped on the letters. "You were having an affair. Your lover was an inmate. And your husband had just found out he was HIV positive." Tanya shook her head rapidly. "That doesn't mean Reed cut her off. "We also found sedatives in his system. The same kind prescribed to you 6 months ago." Tanya's breath caught. Her heart pounded violently. Reed leaned back, folding his arms. "We have enough for an arrest warrant." The words barely registered before the door burst open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. "Tanya Reynolds, you're under arrest for the murder of Eric Reynolds." Her world spun as they pulled her hands behind her back, cold steel snapping around her wrists. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had planned everything. And yet, here she was. Caught. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with anticipation and the hum of murmurs. Flashbulbs popped and cameras rolled as reporters jockeyed for the perfect shot of Tanya Reynolds as she entered the room. Her face was a mask of controlled indifference, but beneath it, the weight of the charges was evident. The trial had become a media sensation, with every detail of Tanya's life exposed for the world to see. Her story had captured the public's imagination, the beautiful, scheming woman who had murdered her husband in cold blood, betraying him not only with an affair but with a calculated plan to end his life and inherit everything. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They detailed the affair between Tanya and Jasmine, the letters found in Tanya's locker, the medical records that showed Eric's HIV diagnosis and Tanya's knowledge of it. They painted a picture of a woman driven by greed and a twisted need to be free of the man who had loved her. The evidence was overwhelming. Tanya had drugged Eric, staged the scene to look like a suicide, and shot him with deliberate precision. The prosecution called witness after witness, friends, family, co-workers, each testimony confirming that Tanya had been living a double life. Her friends spoke of her constant need for attention and admiration, her cold demeanor when it came to her husband's declining health, and the secrecy that surrounded her every move. Her co-workers recalled moments where she would talk about her husband with disdain, often hinting that she was ready to move on to bigger and better things. But the most damning evidence came from the medical examiner, who explained the trajectory of the gunshot wound, pointing out the inconsistencies with the suicide theory. The sedatives found in Eric's system were traced back to Tanya, and the fact that there was no gunpowder residue on his hands confirmed that he had not shot himself. Every piece of evidence tied Tanya to the murder in a way that left no room for doubt. Throughout the trial, Tanya's demeanor remained the same, detached, almost bored. When it was her turn to take the stand, she maintained a calm composure. She denied everything, claiming she had acted in self-defense. She told the court that Eric had become violent, that he had threatened her life, and that she had feared for her own safety when she shot him. She painted herself as the victim, a woman pushed to the edge by a man who had betrayed her. But her words fell flat, swallowed up by the damning evidence that painted a far darker picture. The defense team did their best to create doubt. They tried to suggest that Eric's declining health and erratic behavior had led to a breakdown in their marriage, but the jury wasn't swayed. The affair, the HIV diagnosis, and Tanya's blatant disregard for her husband's life overshadowed any claims of self-defense. Tanya's lack of remorse, her calculated actions leading up to the murder, and the way she staged the scene to mislead the investigators made it clear that she had planned the murder with cold precision. As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. The room fell silent as the judge called for order and announced Tanya's fate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Tanya Reynolds, guilty of first-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, but Tanya remained stoic. She didn't flinch, didn't react to the verdict. It was as though it meant nothing to her, just another step in a game she had lost. The judge's voice cut through the silence again, sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tanya's expression didn't change. She had gotten what she deserved, but the indifference in her eyes told a story of someone who didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of her actions. Jasmine's name had been mentioned throughout the trial, though she was not physically present in the courtroom. The prosecution had insinuated that she had played a role in orchestrating the murder from behind bars, but there had been no direct evidence to charge her with anything other than conspiracy. The love letters found in Tanya's locker had been scrutinized, but there was no definitive proof that Jasmine had been an active participant in the murder itself. However, once Tanya was convicted, the authorities turned their attention to Jasmine. They investigated her connections to Tanya more thoroughly, combing through her correspondence with Tanya while she was incarcerated. The investigators uncovered messages that suggested Jasmine had known about Tanya's plans, that she had encouraged her to take drastic measures to rid herself of Eric. It wasn't enough to charge her with direct involvement in the murder, but it was enough to charge her with conspiracy. Jasmine's arrest was swift. She was transferred to a maximum security prison where she would serve her sentence for conspiring to murder Eric Reynolds. The sentencing was a stark contrast to Tanya's. Jasmine had been a prisoner already, but now she would face even more time for her role in the plot. Her expression was one of disbelief as the judge read the sentence, and the courtroom once again filled with reporters and cameras eager to capture every moment. The media coverage of the case didn't slow down after the trial. Stories about Tanya's past, her affair, and the brutal murder of Eric Reynolds continued to dominate the headlines. It was a story too shocking, too twisted, to be forgotten easily. Tanya had become a symbol of betrayal and cold calculation, a woman whose desire for freedom and wealth had led her to destroy everything in her path. As for Tanya, her life behind bars would be one of isolation and regret, though she would never admit to the true depth of her crime. She would live out her days in the harsh confines of a prison cell, her name forever tied to the brutal murder of her husband. But in the end, justice had been served. The law had caught up with her, and she would face the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. Jasmine, too, would pay for her part, though her time in prison would likely be less harsh. Her role as an accomplice was clear, but the full extent of her involvement remained clouded in uncertainty. Still, both women would live with the consequences of their choices, and the world would continue to watch as their stories played out in the public eye. Justice had been done, but it was cold and final. The price of their betrayal was steep, and neither of them would ever be free again. What began as a reckless affair, a dangerous romance built on lies and deceit, spiraled into a deadly game. Tanya believed she could cover her tracks, bury her secrets and escape unscathed. But the truth, like always, found a way to rise to the surface. The evidence, the betrayal, and the final act of murder would not be silenced. In the end, Tanya couldn't outrun the consequences. But was Tanya just a woman driven by a misguided love that pushed her to the edge? Or was she a cold-blooded killer, willing to destroy everything, including the man she once loved, just to protect herself? Let us know what you think in the comments below. For more jaw-dropping true crime stories, subscribe to True Crime Exposed.